stupid, stupid, and stupid! You're so stupid! Hello, and welcome to Government is Stupid. Today I want to talk about a fledgling government that was for once actually trying to do something noble and morally correct. The problem they ran into, though, was that the only tools they had available to bring about this attempt were stupid ones, and that is government. And so this effort was bound to fail. Yes, today I want to talk about the United States Constitution as it actually is, separating it from this reverence that we Americans have been kind of taught to have for it. Today, the National Archives spends tons of money preserving one of the original copies of the Constitution. They keep it in this specially designed case that's filled with inert gases and climate control and yada yada yada. Because it's written on ancient vellum, so it's very fragile. And Americans line up to look at this thing on display, and most of them don't really know what it is. So let's rewind a little bit and talk about it. As Americans have all been taught, the 13 original U.S. colonies declared their independence from Great Britain on July 4th, 1776. And the British Empire, being a typical government, responded predictably. So the war for independence was on. And it would last until 1783, with Britain finally admitting defeat and signing the Treaty of Paris, which recognized the sovereignty of the United States. So now, with a sovereign nation to run, it was time for a formal charter for the government that would run it. And that charter was the Constitution. Now, to their credit, the authors of the Constitution did recognize the shortcomings of the government they just finished fighting to be free from. First of all, being ruled by a dynastic monarchy just fucking sucks. So they did away with that shit straight away. And one of the reasons why monarchies suck is that the power is vested in just one person. And the whole nation then just suffers for that one person's whims. Oftentimes because that one person wields supreme power. So the founders of the Constitution just made sure the United States wouldn't be a monarchy. So that was nice of them. What they gave us instead was a republic. Now, in many ways, a republic is just a democracy with extra steps. And a democracy is usually just mob rule with suits and ties. But republics do try to tame the whims of the mob by binding the lawmakers from doing certain things by way of a government charter that prevents them from, going too far and doing certain things. And in the United States, that charter is, again, the Constitution. And it lays out the means by which people elect their representatives and president, and then how those elected officials are supposed to go about the business of enacting and enforcing laws. And those laws would be checked against what the Constitution allows by a separate part of the government known as the judiciary. And then someone thought that the peasantry, might just, and their rights specifically, might warrant a mention just beyond how to count them when it comes to determining congressional seats. So the Bill of Rights was tacked on at the end, representing the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, which could be further amended by its own rules, which were contained in Article 5 of the Constitution. So brilliant! We, the peasantry, just have to pick one usually kind of oddly well-positioned peasant from among us. But anyway, then he goes on to represent our peasant village at the big assembly of other states at the Capitol. And then our representative makes sure that our needs are accounted for by either voting or not for this idea or that. And then all those ideas that get voted on will ultimately face judicial scrutiny anyway. And so because the original charter of the Constitution was so solidly written, nothing can go terribly wrong for us peasants as far as our rights are concerned, right? That's all sorted. It should just be smooth sailing to the heights of societal evolution from there, right? Spoiler alert! It did not work out that way. And sure, the Constitution probably sounded pretty bulletproof to the authors at the time, and their naivete is almost adorable in hindsight. It's like you almost want to just pinch Thomas Jefferson's cheeks and oh, you little rascal, you optimistic little twerp. Nice try, but you ended up giving power to the same enemies of liberty you swore eternal enmity to on the altar of God. Which is a great quote, but, the dude owned people, so I don't know how you square that circle mentally. But, anyway, Because as more than 2 centuries of hindsight has shown us, not only could things still go terribly wrong in terms of the peasantry and their rights, as far as individual liberty goes, but they absolutely would, and almost immediately. I mean, it didn't even take that long, never mind a couple centuries. See, the new U.S. federal government decided to do what governments do, and they enacted a tax on a product produced within their jurisdiction, in this case, whiskey. And these being proper Americans at the time, 1791, many whiskey distillers just straight up refused to pay the tax and even resorted to violence and intimidation against the people coming to collect it. Because fucking hell yeah, that's what started this country. Anyway, sorry, I digress. In 1794, then President George Washington, though, he sent federal marshals into western Pennsylvania, where these distillers who weren't paying the tax were located, to collect said tax. And at the time, this was an act that then Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson just did not approve of, but he didn't really protest publicly either. He wrote to James Madison about it, and he basically just pointed out that, you know, it was only about 20 or so years ago that they'd been shooting over this very sort of thing, and now they were the assholes. Funny how time flies, right? And then you fast forward another 230-ish years to today, and Jefferson's own worst nightmares would just be realized. I mean, remember, this is the man who detested his boss sending federal goons to collect a tax the enactment of which he didn't even agree with. So how could he possibly cope with seeing every American citizen reduced to being a free-range slave on an oligarchy's giant tax plantation? I mean, we are forced to fork over more than a third of the fruits of our labor every year just on fear of imprisonment. I mean, the excise tax on whiskey that started the Whiskey Rebellion was 6 to 18 cents per gallon. Again, and this is 1791 money, so not insignificant, but it would add on up to a optional flat rate of 54 cents per gallon of a still's capacity. If you were a bigger stiller, this might have made sense for you, I guess. But even for adjusting for inflation, that's a small tax on one item compared to paying a third of one's entire income just for bothering to be productive for a living. And yet, the government was willing to resort to military force way back in 1791 to collect that tax, just like it'll happily cage your ass for income tax evasion today. And the income tax is just one of the many government abuses Jefferson would be positively apoplectic over if he were somehow cruelly transported to the present to see what's become of his grand experiment. Because, I mean, his Bill of Rights now, it's only respected where it's irrelevant, because, I mean, there's just not much need to quarter ICE goons in people's private homes when they can just use our tax money to put them up in Hilton hotels. So the Third Amendment has remained largely inviolate this whole time. Of the 10 amendments, that one the government stuck to. So, I mean, there's that. I mean, 10% on most tests is still a very solidly failing grade, but hey, you know, I guess we just got to give them some credit where we can. No, I know. But what went wrong? Okay, I mean, why did the Constitution, with its clever system of checks and balances that we all learned about in school, completely fail to keep the government's power in check and balanced against the rights of the peasantry? Well, in essence, the Constitution was something of an experiment in real time to come up with the question of life, the universe, and everything. No, wait, that's the earth itself. The Constitution was written, wittingly or not, to see if government could be used to limit government. And for those hoping that it could, reality would hit them very much like a Vogon constructor fleet, and with just as much sympathy. I mean, as the Whiskey Rebellion would prove, the idea that government would want to limit its own power voluntarily was read some terrible poetry and shoved out of an airlock just 2 years after the Constitution was enacted and the first federal government established. And if you are totally befuddled by these references, then I just feel bad for you. Please, read a book. It's not even a long one, really. Anyway, so government clearly cannot be used to limit government. I mean, every measurable metric proves exactly this. As much as Republicans love to talk about how they're the party of small government, not one Republican administration has ever reduced the size, scope, or intrusiveness of government. And Democrats, I mean, they campaign on the very promise of expanding the size, scope, and intrusiveness of government, so obviously it just tends to get bigger under their regimes as well. And why this happens can really be explained in 2 words. Human nature. At the end of the day, we're all just still people. And a certain percentage of us people are varying degrees of good, and the rest are varying degrees of evil. And evil's most distinctive trait is irrational selfishness. And there's really nothing much more selfish than just wanting to be able to coast through life by having to do little else than have kind of no real morals and being able to have a beguiling smile and a willingness to kiss enough hands and shake enough babies to just reach the upper limits of your political power. And of course, the only job description for that is politician. So inevitably, the worst sort of people end up becoming that aforementioned oddly well-positioned peasant among the rest of us that goes off to be a congressman or senator. And when you get hundreds of well-positioned, well-connected people of varying as evil dispositions together, nothing fucking good is likely to come from it. I mean, that insider trading is epidemically rampant among America's government elite. It's just par for the course. I mean, outright corruption, graft, and straight up theft aren't even rare. I mean, these are the people, let's remember, that made up Epstein's and Maxwell's clientele. Okay? If you're eager to commit unspeakable crimes against children, then simply f***ing over your own constituents just isn't even going to move the needle on your moral compass. So while the authors put a ton of effort and thought into shaping the Constitution in such a way that would prevent the government from slipping its leash and just running amok and rampant all over the rights of us peasants, those efforts all came for naught. And the experiment failed because the Constitution, for all its clever checks and balances and rules and limitations, still required people to run it. And there's a lot of room between lawful good and chaotic evil to continue using Dungeons and Dragons references that people may or may not get when it comes to how humans are aligned, basically. And government, not surprisingly then, is really irresistibly attractive to people who are more of a lawful or neutral evil disposition. And since the Constitution allows for laws to be made, or even for itself to be altered, even radically, by a simple majority, well, not simple, but by a majority vote, then trouble is kind of a given when that government inevitably attracts what becomes a majority of evil people to its ranks. And that's already happened, and it's been that way for a long time now. So, over the course of these 2+ centuries, a government has devolved from the constitutional republic we tried to start out with to the corporatist oligarchy that we have today. And corporatism and how our specific oligarchy works is a big enough topic for its own video at least. But in broad strokes, what happened is that over the centuries, the government just amassed a huge amount of taxing and regulatory power. And that sort of power is really something that any corporation with the means to do so is going to want to buy. And because the government is made up of many thousands of fallible individual people, that kind of power can indeed be purchased by those corporations. And along with that power, along with those fallible people come the government authority those people wield. Add to that government's own self-serving need to perpetuate itself and grow its authority, and you have a recipe for the shit show that is modern-day American government. A government that in no way, shape, or form looks anything like what the Constitution's authors possibly imagined, never mind wanted. And those men who wrote the Constitution were themselves in no way perfect to begin with. I mean, many of them owned other human beings, for fuck's sakes. Okay? And they somehow considered themselves eternal enemies of oppression. I can't even imagine the mental gymnastics needed to square that circle. Yet, the document they produced was, relatively speaking, a good one. And the government it intended to create, while still obviously fundamentally flawed by allowing for human slavery, was still quite a bit better than what other people around the world were living under at that time. That it failed is partly its own fault for being too malleable, where it shouldn't have been, and by being way too accommodating to the slave states, but that was necessary to get it passed in the first place, so it doesn't really excuse it, but it explains it. But even if it had been written as an unchanging, unamendable, permanent charter that just put individual liberty above all else, there's still no guarantee that fallible, largely evil humans living under that charter still wouldn't have somehow fucked everything up by now anyway. And leaving aside the obvious built-in moral and philosophical failings of a government charter that allows for human slavery, the Constitution still represents humankind's best attempt, so far, to limit government in favor of individual liberty. And again, in just a couple centuries. That government that it created has devolved into the corporatist oligarchy that we live under today. A government that is way bigger, way more expensive, and way more intrusive and obstructive than anything the founders could have imagined. A government that is, above all else, fucking stupid. If the best attempt of some of the most enlightened statesmen of their era to create a government charter that does its best to protect individual liberty can completely be undone in a few centuries, then there's little reasons that today's best thinkers would be able to be capable of crafting one that works and actually stands the test of time. Because at the end of the day, if there's a government, if there's an armed gang with a local monopoly on the legal initiation of violence, then that government's inherent flaws are always going to be insurmountable. It is simply illogical to suspect that fallible humans will forever resist the temptation to misuse the power that government grants them, especially when they've famously failed to do so every time that temptation has presented itself so far throughout history. So to think that we're just one more election, one more constitutional amendment, one more government coalition, or one more new government charter away from finally getting this whole idea of allowing other humans to rule us to work properly and not devolve into a shit show is frankly stupid. It's never happened, and it's just not likely to. Anyway, thank you for sticking it out this long, and I will see you on the next one. And in the meantime, don't be stupid.